Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Actually, I thought about going through this presentation Pechacucha style, and for those of you who don't know what that is, it's 20 slides and 20 seconds a slide, and then go back and pick up the actual details. So at some point, I'm going to try to talk Michael into doing something a little bit more spectacular like that. But over the past few years, I've spent a lot of time working with organizations that have been struggling with the role of PMOs as they've begun using Agile. And all of us are aware that the penetration of Agile really has, come from, one of the either the left side or the right side, but not the center of where we were in IT, and has now truly become incorporated in how we do work. So organizations that a few years ago would have been, kicking and screaming about not doing Agile are now embracing at least some of the tenets of Agile. The problem, though, and that is, the critical word in all of this is that word struggling, because many PMOs have become more administrative and control-oriented rather than coaches and leaders. And I've found that a path to support both sets of needs can be found if everyone can be flexible and no one is building an empire. And I think that becomes really the tail, the tail of where we were going with this presentation. So I'd like to suggest that there are really three groups that we need to discuss in detail. And obviously in organizations there are many other sort of stakeholder groups or groups, but three that I'd like to mention and work with today. One is the PMO, the second is the Agile team itself, and the third is the customers. Each one of these really has a different set of words and use those words differently. Each one of those parties, sort of a lost in translation kind of a scenario. The term requirement can sometimes suggest, something that is notional and to be evolved. One view of what a requirement is. Whereas in others, people look at that and say, requirement, carved in stone, placed under change control, can't do it without approval, can't make all those changes. And again, each organization using the same word, each one with fundamentally different ideas as to what that word means and how to act when one runs into that. Each group has a different master. The PMO, I'm going to suggest, is really the voice of the management. And the Agile team is, their master truly is the code, functional code. And then finally, the customer, whoever acts as that voice of the customer, obviously is the voice of the business. The business and the market is their master. The goal in all cases, and I'm not arguing that each one of these organizations has a goal that ends with the project not being delivered. The goal is to create value to the organization. Each one of these three, the PMO, the Agile team, the customers, all have a fundamental goal to create value for the organization. They go about it differently. And finally, I would suggest that for PMOs to work in today's environment, that we truly have to hone that value proposition so that they are part of transforming an input into higher value versus something that just monitors that transformation. I like to start usually with a framing quote that I think will somehow foreshadow what we are finding in the real world, in the field. So this quote I like, and I actually have sitting on my wall. And Agile, there's part of it that I think is most important to where we're talking about today. Agile methodologies free the project manager from the drudgery of being a taskmaster, thereby enabling the project manager to focus on being a leader. I think many of you know that I recently published a book on project management with Murali Chematuri from India. During the process, we played out this agile versus standard project management passion play between each other as we wrote the book. In many cases, the differences broke down into a set of dichotomies: administration versus leadership, control versus facilitation, taskmaster versus coach. The quote we're looking at suggests that Agile can free up project manager to be a coach, but this only works if the organization ends up getting its own data needs met. So why did I call this this presentation? Why was I paying an homage to John Gray? I think, obviously many of you know the book, The Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. And the title of this whole presentation, this whole webinar, is a nod to that book. And it's a nod to the part that really talks about communication. As I've mentioned, I think that most of us have the same goal in a project. How we pursue that goal and the language that we use is different. So, as Dr. Gray suggests, communication is better if we acknowledge our differences. So, but to be able to draw those differences, I think we have to draw some lines in the sand. And let's start with the historical roles of a project manager and a PMO. And I'm using the word project manager in some cases somewhat loosely. So the common roles of a PMO: measurement, how are we doing? Tracking, where are we? Reporting, status, those kinds of things. Facilitating change, connecting groups of people. One of I think the most important kinds of roles of a PMO, and macro risk reporting, finding those macro risks, taking that outside view of risk and making sure that we're ready in case something happens. And then compliance. Are you following the process? All of these activities, I would suggest, are important, but they're not directly involved in turning ideas and effort into product. They might facilitate that. They might make sure that it happens and make sure that things don't happen to stop it, but they're not directly in part of that transformation. Therefore, they're apt to be targeted, to be leaned. I think I'd like you to tuck into the back of your mind for now that these focus areas are, I think, what can be thought of as the voice of management. And we'll come back to voices in a few slides as we talk through that kind of concept. But first, let's sort of, since we've drawn a line in the sand, let's actually gouge it, directly into the sand. So, while I don't think we talk much about the iron triangle anymore, I'd like all the project managers or administrators on this or listening to this webinar to ask themselves whether they control any of these factors. And if not, whether the role that they're doing is much more than a recorder of project data, or finding the right conference room, or booking the right meeting, rather than the leader, manager, or coach. I would suggest that responsibility without influence, you notice I didn't say responsibility without authority. A lot of people have written about that, and I think the world is such that you can have responsibility without authority, but you can't have responsibility without influence and use that efficiently. And without that influence,